Hello and welcome to this Heroes of Black Reach video. In this video I'm going to be covering my top tips for deployment. So deployment is the step in which you place your army onto the battlefield, and it can make the difference between getting blown off the battlefield early on or being able to advance towards your opponent in quite a tactical and smart manner. So let's go through some of the things you need to think about when you're doing deployment in Heroes of Black Reach. So which units need to be deployed together? So by that I mean think about the range of special abilities. So for example, it makes sense to put a mech next to a mech gun so that the mech can repair the mech gun if it gets damaged. It would not really make sense to put the mech on one side of the battlefield and the mech gun on the other. The same applies to units like the Pain Boy or the Squigs. So units that have passive abilities that are affected by range, make sure that that unit is in range of the unit that it can help. Otherwise you've wasted an opportunity. Another thing to consider is whether your opponent has indirect fire. If they have the capability to do indirect fire, then it's usually a good idea to spread out your units. Indirect fire means that you place one of the templates down when it fires. So if your units are all bunched together, then that template can hit more units. So you would potentially lose more units if you have them all bunched up together and your opponent gets a hit. If you're defending, then how far away are the enemy? Do you need to be right on top of the barricades in turn 1? If you can't really shoot at them, or is it better to perhaps wait behind the barricades until the enemy get closer so that they don't have any targets? Although something to bear in mind there is that orcs can't usually fire on the move, so if you have put them out of the way, when you do move them, you won't be able to fire. So you need to think about moving your army forward in the supply phase to be ready for the next turn. If you're better in close assault, then perhaps let the enemy come to you a little bit before you engage them. So use your long range units to try and pick them off as they approach, and then hide your good assault units until the enemy are right upon you. So they're really saying don't waste your strong assault units trying to do a shooting role. If they're good at close assault, let them be used in close assault and use units that are good for the particular role in that role. Another thing to consider, corridors that vehicles may move about the battle grid. And is it possible to block some of those routes with your own vehicles? So putting a vehicle in the entranceway of a barricade, for example, means that you might be able to block your opponent's movement. It might mean that you can direct your opponent into a particular direction, that you can make one side of the battle grid feel a little less heavily defended than the other side. That's an example of limiting your opponent's options. So when presented with the whole battlefield, then your opponent can do all kinds of different things. But if you can limit their choices and force them into making choices that work for you, then that can give you an advantage. And when you're deploying your units, you can start to be thinking about these things right from the start. One thing to do is, if you are playing at one end of the game board and your opponent's playing at the other end, it's quite good sometimes to go perhaps around to the side or even to view the battlefield from their end, provided they've got their order tokens hidden. But just to see from their perspective what they are facing when they look at your army. Sometimes you don't spot things from your side that you see as soon as you go round to the side and you start to try and think in the mind of your opponent. So if you are defending, then there are perhaps some more things to think about when it comes to deployment. So when you're defending, something that's quite important to think about is lines of fire. In other words, if you can create a crisscross of fire lines across the battlefield, it means that as your opponent considers moving forwards, they suddenly become under fire from potentially multiple units from different angles. And it makes it harder for them to move forward because you have them pinned in different angles. For example, if you've got two Death Dreads or Killer Cans, you can set them up so that each Killer Can kind of see each other and also diagonal lines across the battlefield, and so they defend each other and they can attack different parts of the battlefield. So position your units so you've got multiple units that can attack key points and key routes that your opponent might move towards. Another thing to think about is Overwatch, particularly when you're defending. You're probably not going to be doing a lot of moving, but your opponent probably is. And so having the ability to overwatch your opponent, that is to be able to fire when they're moving, is a very powerful ability. Units such as the Tank Busters have the Overwatch ability, and so they're very good at hitting moving targets when it's not your turn. So you can place them in key positions, set up lines of fire, and they become very difficult for your opponent to move through without you being able to hit them. Another thing that you might want to do when you're defending is to put up a screen. Having a screen of weaker units means that your opponent has to deal with those units before they get through to deal with the things that they perhaps want to. So even a unit that's as cheap as Grots can be used to block units such as, say, a squad of tactical marines. Because of zone of control, those Grots can be quite powerful in blocking movement. And so you can use them to screen quite a way in advance of objectives that your opponent is trying to reach. That applies more to Orcs than to Ultramarines, because Orcs have cheaper, weaker units. But you can still do that to some extent with the Ultramarines. So zones of control and vehicles are things that you can use to stop enemy infantry from moving through positions. Since enemy infantry cannot move through vehicles, and since they can't move through zones of control, then careful positioning of your units can mean that you completely block lines of attack from your opponent. Your opponent may have to spend 1 or 2 turns clearing out units in order to be able to get around and past and through obstructions that you've placed on the battlefield. Another thing to think about is outflanking your opponent. It's often quite good to put fast units on the flanks because they can move around your opponent and then potentially come at them from another angle. So often vehicles are quite good at flanking maneuvers, especially things like the war buggy. Even transport units and tanks can be used for outflanking maneuvers. So whether you're deploying first or second can make a difference to where you deploy. Typically the first player will deploy first, second player second, and then the first player will have their turn. And so if you are the player who goes second, then you have the ability to react to your opponent's deployment when you do your deployment. So depending on the way that they've laid out their units, you might then position your units in slightly different ways. However, obviously if you're going first, then you have to kind of place your units in such a way that you can encourage your opponent to place theirs in a particular way. So by placing, for example, all of your strong units all on one side of the battlefield will probably prompt a response from your opponent when they do their deployment. Spreading your entire army out all along the line would probably give a different kind of deployment from your opponent. So bear in mind that the deployment that you do, if you go first, will influence the deployment that your opponent does, if they're paying attention. And likewise, if you go second, you have the ability to react to their deployment. And so, whether you go first or second, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. So even when you're deploying your army, one thing you can think about is the duration of the game. Let's say you have 6 turns, you need to get across the battle grid and you need to claim an objective. Where do you think you need to be after each turn? Break it down into stages. Think about those 6 turns. Think about where do I need to be across the battle grid at different points in time. And think about how your deployment can affect your ability to move across the battlefield and meet those kind of targets for each turn. You may not be able to do very much about it in deployment, but sometimes deployment can make a difference as to your ability to move across the battlefield. Putting a unit on one side versus the other side in the middle can make a difference as to how easily you can navigate across the terrain that your opponent is defending. So I hope you found some of this discussion useful and that you'll have a few things to think about when you're doing your own deployments. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.